Krishnan, I came in from Jordan today, and as you found on the road from Lebanon, it was peaceful. The rebels on the checkpoints, if we can still call them rebels, fighters, were quite calm, they were quite kind, they were happy to see us. But what people in Damascus have been talking about are these Israeli airstrikes. I was speaking to some who said the noise last night was absolutely terrifying. And Israel has carried out more than 300 airstrikes since the Assad government fell. And then also up in the northeast, the Turks have also been bombing, presumably what they see as Kurdish targets, because they're worried about the Kurds getting more power and that spilling over into Turkey. So what we can see is people here are calling it a revolution. People here that I've been speaking to are happy about what's going on. But what happens here in Syria doesn't stay in Syria. From across the water, Syrians could see and film the Israeli strikes that destroyed their country's naval fleet. The Israeli defense minister said they were only acting to protect Israel's borders, although the port of Latakia is 650 kilometers from Tel Aviv. Israel hit a weapons site in Damascus too. Smoke was still rising as we drove towards it this afternoon. Israel bombed this place 3 times overnight. It's called the Scientific Research Center. That's a euphemism. It was a weapons development facility. What people I've been speaking to say is that they know there used to be chemical weapons there. We don't know if there still were. Israel has also seized a strip of territory on the border, causing anger and resentment. A group of people I met told me they believed that Israel, the US and Britain had supported Assad and now wanted to deprive the new government of his military assets. Earlier on the road from Jordan, we saw remnants of Syria's military, an army that once dared to attack Israel, but in recent years a hollowed-out force busy repressing the Syrian people. There obviously was a battle here. There are bullet casings all over the ground. So Assad's forces did put up something of a fight in this place. But in the end, they just abandoned their tanks and fled, as they did everywhere. Rebels manning the checkpoints said they weren't worried about escaped soldiers.
هلا في منهم المتخبي بالبيوت موجود هنا بس شو طبعا ضمن السلام تسليم السلاح وإذا كان عليه أي شيء سيقوم محاسبته.
As the fighters established control, a caretaker prime minister said former ministers had handed over institutions and files.
This means there will be a Syrian government that will handle these files and manage the business during a transitional period, God willing, that may end on March the 1st. The General Command has tasked us with running the transitional government until March the 1st, 2025.
Around Umayyad Square in Damascus, we found people still celebrating 2 days after the fall of the dictator. Tell me, how are you feeling today?
I'm feeling so happy. Finally, we are free here. I'm very happy. We are all happy. We are proud that Syria is free right now.
And do you think that you will stay free?
I hope we're gonna stay free.
Do you trust Jolani and these rebels?
Yeah, actually, yeah, for sure. I trust that people because they do the revolution. They sacrifice for this country. Even I have maybe different thinking with them, but they did a lot and they deserve to be a part of the new government.
Celebratory gunfire, so much hope and so much peril. All people here care about is that the hated dictator is gone. But Turkey, like Israel, has been bombing where it sees a threat. Neighbouring governments are asserting their interests and fearing that the freedom these people crave will turn to chaos and spill over Syria's borders.
Now, the man behind the fall of Assad's regime and the kingmaker of all that happens next is the Syrian rebel leader Abu Muhammad Jolani. So how did he get here? In 2003, a 21-year-old Jilani, radicalized by the Palestinian Intifada and the 9/11 attacks, went to fight against the US-led occupation of Iraq. In 2006, now fighting with al-Qaeda, he was captured and imprisoned by US forces. Released in 2011, he crossed back into Syria to lead an offshoot of the Islamic State of Iraq. 2 years later, he pledged allegiance of his al-Nusra Front fighters to al-Qaeda. But by 2016, he had split with al-Qaeda, beginning a process of consolidation of power over a group that he would rebrand Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. HTS took control of northern Idlib in 2019, since when Jilani has attempted to show moderation towards minorities, whilst also overseeing spasms of repression against dissidents. It is very much the moderate, changed Jilani who is now to the fore. Official HTS language even dropping his jihadi nom de guerre for his birth name, Ahmed al-Sharaa. Well, joining me now is Fuad Said Issa. He's a Syrian activist and founder of Violet, an organisation which supports human rights and refugees in Syria. I mean, first of all, how are you feeling tonight? What state is this country in?
It's a big shock for every Syrian here, but we're so happy that we're in the first days without Assad here. And the Syrians are happy everywhere, like we're feeling that from the people. For me also personally, it's my first time until 2011 to be able to be here in Damascus. Then that's a great feeling. We were trying all the time to continue and following the humanitarian needs around and during these 10 days, and we were doing our best, but the things like could be better in the next days, and this is what the people telling us.
I mean, there is an extraordinary atmosphere here. I mean, no soldiers, no checkpoints, no instruments of the state. I mean, people are ignoring traffic lights, which is sort of an indication of sort of the mood people are in. Do you trust it?
I mean, we were shocked. All of us are not believing what's happening, how you can drive your car from here to Idlib and going back to Daraa and going all through Syria without any checkpoints, without any soldiers. And how is it like the freedom here, and how is everyone telling the stories, speaking? We don't understand what's happened and how it could be in the future, but the people have a very great hopes for the future.
Now you as Violet, as a humanitarian organisation, you have a lot of experience of working with these people in HTS.
Yeah.
So, I mean, tell us about them in terms of how trustworthy, how competent, how moderate they are.
I think there is a huge changing in their also mindset during the last 3 years, and how we find the things happening here in Damascus is so different from what we see before in Idlib and other places. Now they are acting in very well way, as we are see we have a full freedom as a humanitarian organization to work on the ground, to do our response, and also to work with the people. And we're still there is some worries from the people on what could happen in the future, how the things going, and also especially with the services, because all the government falling down now, and now we need to look for our future. But in general, the people feeling comfortable, and we are in Violet trying also to expand our services in whole of Syria.
But this is also very fragile, isn't it? I mean, our correspondents have been, reporting a very febrile atmosphere and a lot of anger, particularly around the prison and the whole question of prisoners, and real fury amongst the people affected by that.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think that will turn into something bigger?
I'm not sure what will happen, but I mean, as a humanitarian organization, we are trying all the time to focus on how we can be, able to work with Syria and to support them, and how all of those refugees could be back to their home. And that was happening now. The people are coming from all the borders, from Turkey, Lebanon, and other places, to just arrive to their cities. And that's what the matter for us.
Now, what about the bombing by Israel? I mean, they say that this is responsible bombing, that this is the taking out of chemical weapons stores, of any weapons of mass destruction that could be used by extremists, either against Israel or Western targets. I mean, what do you make of that explanation, and how do people here feel about it?
I mean, that's unfortunately a crime against the Syrian people when you destroyed all of the services and things in Syria, but the militaries also as well. But in the end, I mean, the people are not so much interested in that, to be honest, because they are feeling somehow, I mean, unless the people in Idlib and the other were all the time just thinking about the bombing coming to them as a humanitarian people, the normal life. Now it's a different story. Then the normal civilians are not just, I mean, so connected with that, and there is no that much like communication about these things.
And what can you tell us about the new Prime Minister? Do you know anything about him?
The Prime Minister were working in Idlib in the last 2 years unless, and we worked like we were coordinating in the area of their control, and they were like helping us, especially the last 2 years. In the beginning, they were struggling with this government for humanitarian organizations sometimes, but the last 2 years were great to Idlib and to the area. They were working to develop the area, and they were supporting the humanitarian organization. But
And do you believe they will help the whole country, or just the people from their community?
We do hope so, like, because the acting, how they are act now in Damascus, how they are trying to do the work. Today we were in many places in Syria as a violet. We were in Latakia, we were in Tartus and the other cities where that was like something unbelievable to have someone from Idlib helping the people in this area. We were all the days, our teams were just distributing the breads and helping the people, and that was with accepting from this government. They were saying that no problem, go and help the people and the need, I mean, in everywhere in Syria. And that's somehow giving us the hope that Syria will be back for all Syrians, and they will act as we hope, as a Syrian, and also they will have international relation in better way with the other governments, especially the governments who were supporting the Syrians, the humanitarian also organization during all of these years.
Fuad Saidi, so thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, the leader of HTS has vowed to pursue officials responsible for torture and war crimes during Assad's violent regime. Sidnaya prison just outside Damascus has become a byword for the brutality meted out by his enforcers. When the Syrian government collapsed, families of those detained rushed there in the hope of being reunited with loved ones. But as rescue workers end their search, many families remain in limbo tonight. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent, Porrick O'Brien, joins me now. Porrick.
Krish, we arrived in Damascus yesterday, went more or less straight to Syria. We returned there this morning and spent most of the day there. I have to say I've never seen or heard anything like it in my journalistic career. It's an enormous complex. It's over about 10 stories, at one point 11,000 prisoners inside, many of them from the opposition. It was a torture and execution centre. It was a termination camp, basically, but one that just closed the day before yesterday. I should warn viewers that, as you'd expect, there are graphic descriptions of torture in our report. A new dawn over Damascus, framed by the smoke from another Israeli strike. Assad's weapons facilities hit so militants don't get their hands on what's inside. This morning, en route to one of the world's most infamous prisons, we stop at this square in Damascus. The preamble to the hope of normality's return: sweep up the cartridges, tiptoe on tank turrets. But all of this belies the anger and the pain. Much of it produced in Syria prison, Syria's trauma factory.
ذنبهم انه طالبوا بالحريه هذا كان ثمنه بعده كله اثار دم.
60 people from this man's neighborhood in Idlib were taken here. They all disappeared. He shows us nooses he's found in the cells, rope stained red with blood. This woman's 3 sons taken here from Dara at the beginning of the Syrian uprising 12 years ago. She hasn't seen them since.
بدنا نعرف وينه الميت، يعني نعرفه خلص مات بسبيل الله، والطيب نشوفه ترد روحنا علينا. أنا قاعد أموت، أنا من قبل الحج أموت، والحج العالم طلعت كلها وأنا ما طلعت. دخيلك يا الله ارحمني.
Thousands have died and gone missing inside these walls since 2011. The torture and the murder is well documented. But being inside is different. And being brought in by a mother looking for her 3 sons is something else entirely. She brings us to the giant iron press, She and others told us it was used to compact the bodies of the executed for easier disposal.
عم يعدموا هون ويكبسوا هون.
هلا شو هذا الموجود هون؟
مكبس عالم مكبس بشري.
This grotesque machine, again, well documented. We spent the best part of 2 days here, saw and heard accounts of unspeakable things. But some of the worst were the hundreds of calculated humiliations administered to every person every day. Muhammad was tortured here for 6 years, set free 2 days ago. But it's the smaller things he remembers.
يفوتوا شاي مثلا يفوتوا بالشاي الجاط هالقد فيه كبوا لنا اياه بالارض. نحن الشاي شلون نلاقيه؟ طب بدنا نشرب، نحن بدنا شيء حلو يعني لجسمنا. نجيب اسفنجة نعصر باسفنجة ونعصر بالكاسات البلاستيك اللي عندنا.
Then the guards would stand there laughing at them. In front of the prison, a huge crowd gathered, and they were angry. It was directed at the Alawite community, from where much of Assad's support came from. The Sunni Hayat Tahrir al-Sham spearheaded his downfall, but how will they deal with the possibility of sectarian violence? So we were here yesterday, and the atmosphere has really changed here today. There is a real sense of anger in the air. This could be HDS's one of their first priorities, one of their first challenges. People here are much angrier. The man you've just heard on the truck had a list of 50 officers that used to work in this prison. He says if they do not get justice soon, they will go into those Alawite communities along the coast and they will seek their own sort of revenge. All day long, people pored over discarded lists of prisoners and of executions, looking for clues of loved ones' whereabouts, told us stories of extreme torture. But perhaps the most poignant testimonies, mothers and fathers listing the names of their missing ones.
حسام زين الدين.
معتقل ياسر محمد خير المظلوم واسماعيل محمد خير المظلوم وبشار دولة.
محمد الأحمد
نضال أبو عساف محمد عباس حسين إبراهيم أكرم مرعي.
Praying that the people named would somehow hear this roll call.
Well, the UN has urged Israel to stop its airstrikes on Syria, saying it could impede the country's transition to peace and stability. But Israel's Prime Minister insisted tonight that it was essential to stop weapons falling into the hands of jihadists. Earlier, Benjamin Netanyahu appeared in court. His argument that he has a war to run, failing to prevent his trial on corruption charges from going ahead. Here's Jonathan Rugman.
With the Syrian dictator's downfall, Israel has seized its moment, with hundreds of airstrikes in the last few days. Their aim is to destroy Syrian helicopters and jets, to prevent the rebels who've taken over from arming themselves. Among the targets, the port of Latakia on the Mediterranean, quickly vacated by the Russian Navy last week, but Syria's own fleet still a sitting duck for the Israeli Air Force.
From here I warn the rebel leaders in Syria. Whoever follows Assad's path will end up like Assad. We will not allow an extreme Islamic terrorist entity to act against Israel.
We are continuing to see Israeli movements and bombardments into Syrian territory. This needs to stop. This is extremely important.
Israeli paratroopers have also advanced beyond the Golan Heights they captured from Syria over 50 years ago into what they're now calling a sterile defensive zone, though who knows how long they will stay. The Israelis inadvertently helped topple President Assad through their attacks on his Iranian and Hezbollah allies. Now they say they're not meddling in the country's future, even if to some it might look that way.
We have no intention of interfering in Syria's internal affairs. However, we do intend to do what is necessary for our security.
But Mr. Netanyahu is under siege himself. Earlier, he appeared in a cramped courtroom in Tel Aviv. His trial now moved underground for his own safety. In the State of Israel versus its own Prime Minister, charged with bribery and fraud. His line of defence, I'm running a country, I'm running a war. His trial began 4 years ago, and his lawyers have been battling to delay this first appearance. And it's a trial which forced him out of power and then into coalition with Israel's far right. These latest airstrikes on Syria may help keep that coalition together and the Prime Minister in office, even though he says it's to stop weapons falling into the hands of jihadists who might help Iran and attack Israel. Neither of which seems likely, given that the Iranians backed Assad and that Israel is the least of Syria's problems right now.
Well, the Israeli government spokesperson David Mensa joins us now live from Tel Aviv. Thank you for joining us. When you say that you're trying to stop weapons getting into the hands of jihadists, who do you mean? Do you mean HTS, who are now in control of this country?
Thank you for having me on, Krishnan. Nothing would make us happier in Israel to have a peaceful border and peaceful relationships with our neighbours in Syria. We hope that does indeed come to pass with whatever the leadership takes place or if it forms in Syria. But we simply do not have the luxury of waiting to see what happens, as you do in London. This is our neighbourhood. In Israel, we've got to do what we need to do to protect ourselves. We can't have jihadis embedding themselves on our northern border and chemical weapons in the hand of jihadis. We hope that they are these moderate jihadis that we're all hearing about. Chemical weapons in their hands is simply not a good idea. So we're taking care of them.
This is all preemptive, isn't it? I mean, they're not attacking you as things stand. They're not attacking you. They're not advancing towards you. And the question is who you mean. You know, do you mean the likely government of the new Syria?
We mean that anyone that means to attack us. We've got our eyes wide open here. I say again that we very much hope that there is a new beginning for Syria. No one can have been helped but been moved by how the Syrian people have shaken off this dictator. 500,000 people Assad is responsible for. We're all moved at them shaking off the dictatorship. But chemical weapons and fighter aircraft in the hands of jihadis, the same jihadis that evolved from ISIS, the same jihadis that evolved from Islamic State and Daesh, is simply not a good idea. The US has taken action in the last days or so against ISIS, and we are as well, because these weapons falling into the hands of jihadis is simply not a good idea.
Well, I mean, you're still being a bit vague about who you mean precisely, but I mean, why are you attacking the Syrian Navy, for example? There's no question of naval warships being in the hands of ISIS. You know, that is precisely the kind of attack that the UN means when it says you are destabilizing this very fragile situation.
Again, in London, you have the luxury to wait and see what happens. We simply don't have that luxury here in Israel. These are jihadists. Okay, so Israel instructed...
No, but why are you attacking the Navy? There are no jihadists taking over the Navy.
So I'm not sure what you mean. If there is a jihadist regime taking control in Syria, or if Iran...
So you do mean to attack the new government here? So all you're saying about how exciting it is, you mean the government here, HTS. That's what you're trying to attack.
We're protecting ourselves against jihadis. The new government doesn't need chemical weapons. It doesn't need fighter jets right now. It needs to rebuild a life for the future of its own citizens. We want that to be a peaceful future on our northern border. We simply don't have the luxury. After the October the 7th massacres, these are jihadis which praised those massacres. They want to emulate them. Some of them do. So, you know, you in London can wait and see what happens. We here in Israel don't have that luxury. We will defend ourselves. We're taking these pieces off the chessboard.
I mean, I'm actually speaking to you from Damascus rather than London, but of course a lot of people here will also say, well, who are you to talk about weapons of mass destruction or fearsome weapons, given the kinds of weapons you've been using on Palestinians in Gaza?
We've been engaged in a war against Hamas, not against Gazans. We've tried our hardest to get Gazans out of harm's way. We're close to finishing off Hamas. That's one of the reasons why Iran has been exposed. They are weakened, which is why the rebel groups have managed to take control in Syria. We hope this is a new beginning for Syria. We're desperate for good relations with our neighbors. But if that does not come to pass, then we must have ourselves protected. We cannot have jihadists on our border which seek to replay again the October 7th massacre. It won't happen again.
I mean, you know, bombing your neighbours is not the best way to find good relations with them, is it?
So, Krishnan, you're a little bit obsessed with Israel, if I may say so. We've made very, very clear what our intentions are.
Well, you're the Israeli spokesman. That's why I'm asking you about Israel's policies.
And I'm giving you our policy. Our policy is, number one, we want peaceful relations. Number two, our neighbors don't need chemical weapons. They simply don't need them.
David Benson, we must leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Let's go to Kieran now in Leeds.
Now, a vital question in the future of Syria is what happens now to the millions of refugees who escaped to neighbouring countries and, of course, to Europe. After the uprisings of 2011 and the violent crackdown of the Assad regime in the years that followed, backed by brutal Russian airstrikes, at least 7 million Syrians, more than a quarter that of Syria's population, fled the country. A refugee crisis that's had far-reaching international consequences, nowhere more so than Syria's neighbours. Turkey has welcomed more Syrian refugees than any country, 3.1 million according to the latest UN figures. Then comes Lebanon with an estimated 1.5 million Syrian refugees. Then we come to Europe. Remember in 2015, Angela Merkel said, we can do this. And Germany is home to the third most refugees and asylum seekers from Syria, 781,000 there. Now, these are the figures as of earlier this year, and they don't include refugees who went on to become citizens of their host country, whether Germany or anywhere else. So the actual numbers will be higher. What about the UK then? Well, the UK is 14th on that particular UN list. Thousands have become British citizens, but in mid-2024 there were 17,000 Syrian refugees and another 6,000 people actively seeking asylum, so waiting, in other words. And yesterday, the UK government announced it has now suspended processing those asylum claims from Syria. And it's not alone. All these European countries also suspending claims, including Germany, France, Italy and Greece, leaving tens of thousands of people potentially in limbo. Spain, though, is not suspending asylum applications for now, while Austria has gone further. Ministers there telling the media they are preparing a deportation programme for Syrians without giving much further detail. Now, what happens next then depends a lot on the actions of HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, in Syria, the new force in Damascus. They are considered a terrorist group by the UN Security Council and many governments, including the US and the UK. Now, that's a clear obstacle for governments who are thinking about their approach. But with most Syrian refugees, as we heard, in neighbouring countries, there's the potential for huge movements of people back to Syria, whatever governments in Europe decide.
So what should happen now to the millions of Syrian refugees who escaped to Europe and other countries? David Miliband is head of the International Rescue Committee and former British Foreign Secretary, of course. He joins me now from New York. Syria must have been your biggest challenge over the last decade. What should happen now to the millions of people who are spread out around the world?
Hi, Krishnan. Good to be with you. Syria has been on our emergency watch list for the last 13 years since the civil war began. We've never fallen for the argument over the last 3 or 4 years that the war was somehow over. And we have about 850 International Rescue Committee staff who are working, 450 of them in the northwest of Syria, where the HTS was one of the large organizations in control, another 400 in the northeast of the country. I think that the most important thing for people to understand is that the vast majority of Syrians who your colleague has just described, whether they're in the Middle East or they're in Europe, and we work in Jordan and Lebanon as well as in the UK and Germany, the vast majority of the Syrian refugees do want to go home. They still talk about their homeland being Syria, but they were too scared to do so. And we've always argued that no one should be deported until it was both safe for them to go home and they wanted to go home. And I think that you'll see large numbers of Syrians looking very carefully at what's happening. Those who are mobile, especially those who are individuals, maybe their kids have grown up and are no longer at school, they'll be the first to think about going back. The imperative, I think, though, is that this be voluntary, because with compulsory deportations to a place that people don't think is yet safe, we're going to end up in an even bigger mess than we are at the moment.
So are you disappointed to see European countries, including Britain, pausing their decisions on asylum, when after all people must still be afraid for their futures?
Well, I think you can understand why it's impossible for an asylum determination to be made at the moment, because an asylum determination has to establish whether or not it's safe to go home. Everyone is waiting to see how the Syrian situation develops. I know from our own teams on the ground that they've been working in a very coherent and disciplined way in the northwest of the country over the last 12 years or so. They've been able to cooperate with the authorities. Civil authorities were established in the northwest of the country so that there was no issue to do with terrorist designation. We worked alongside the civilian authorities in the northwest of the country. So there's a track record there of an established presence that was able to govern that part of the territory. Obviously, the northeast of Syria is a very different kettle of fish. It's Kurdish area of Syria. I think it's reasonable that European countries are saying, we want to see the opportunity grasped. We're not able to make a determination now, but I think it's very important they stick with the idea that returns need to be voluntary. In our experience, there's a lot of Syrians who've already gone back, including from Lebanon. That started about 6 weeks ago, actually, but it's picked up recently, because I think many Syrians, often with attachments to local civil society organizations that still exist within Syria, want to make the most of the opportunity that's been created.
Right, but many of their homes remain destroyed. I mean, there is terrible devastation right across this country still, and cities like Homs and Hama have not been rebuilt since they were smashed up by the regime during the war. Do you think the outside world now is going to have to help Syria rebuild, and that means engaging potentially with HTS if they become a big part of the new stable government?
Well, the short answer to that is yes. I'm sure that there has to be an international effort around the rebuilding of Syria, although I would say that in contrast to the situation before the COVID pandemic, the European Union and the UK actually had committed to help with the reconstruction of Syria. Now, with the invasion of Ukraine, the issues there with the recovery from the pandemic, I think it's much more sensible to look towards the Gulf as the area that will be sponsoring the rebuilding of Syria. On the wider question of governance, I think that the facts on the ground are that the HTS are in control. And that means that engagement in the end is going to have to be essential, because our experience as a humanitarian agency around the world, whether it be in Afghanistan, whether it be in East Africa, in the end, if you want to reach the people, you have to engage with the government.
David Miliband, thank you very much.